Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. My name's Peter Ballerstedt, and Regenerating Public Health is the title. I hope it was catchy enough to get people's interest. So most of us have probably seen some list like this that shows challenges mid-century. And as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century, it's good to look at that. And I come to meetings like this and I see young people and young professionals and students. I go, this is your professional lifetime. But I'm going to suggest that we have a bigger problem, and that is this epidemic of chronic illnesses. And I'm going to present this for personal gain for anyone, as well as to suggest that this is a role for Extension to move into. And I think it has the potential to cross all kinds of barriers and grow awareness and support for Extension. So 60% of US adults have at least one chronic illness, 40% have two or more. 90% of the nation's $4.5 trillion annual healthcare expenditures are dedicated to this issue. And it's going to get worse. So by 2050, here's another factoid for that list. 50 and older are going to double the number of people that have one or more chronic illnesses in people 50 and older, and a little over 90% increase for two or more. So we're seeing this constellation of problems showing up, and yes, we're in the diabesity belt. And that's coined because there's such a tight relationship between obesity and type 2 diabetes. And as the colors get darker, the rate gets higher, just to interpret the images. Okay? But the bad news is it's worse than it looks. Because a quarter of people with the condition are undiagnosed. And we're using cut points that are set too high. We have research suggesting that we should be worried about people whose A1C is approaching 6, let alone the 7, which is what the conventional medical advice is saying, etc. And then the question is, how is this represented in our needs assessments in our communities, and as we think from state and regions? I'm suggesting if they are represented, they may be colored by some conventional wisdom that needs to be re-examined. But the good news is that there's a common root to these conditions. Here's a quote. The reality is when you look at most chronic diseases, they have an underlying metabolic impairment as part of their pathophysiology or pathogenesis. And that's by a professor at one of the OSUs. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the OSU. Professor Jeff Volek. Another quote, virtually every chronic disease has some connection to insulin resistance, where the insulin resistance is either explicitly causing the problem, or it's exacerbating it or accelerating the problem. These are profound quotes by people involved doing research in the subject, not an agronomist, somebody working in biomedical research. And so yes, this is research-based. There's an abundant amount of literature, and I'm happy to share that. And that's part of my mission, is to connect people from the medical side to my tribes in agronomy and ruminant animal agriculture. But just some papers more recently, and I'll stop on the last one because it talks about remission of type 2 diabetes. How many people have heard that type 2 diabetes can be placed into drug-free remission, when conventional wisdom is it's a chronic, progressive, essentially incurable disease? And yet we have drug-free remission being in the literature as an achievable target for lifestyle medicine as opposed to lifetime medication. So the words we use can get in the way. I talked already about some conventional wisdom getting in the way. Let's look at malnutrition as an example. Malnutrition typically consists of undernutrition, one phrase, and overnutrition as another. Now the problem with that is that overnutrition reflects the calories in, calories out paradigm of what leads to obesity. And then obesity is looked at as a cause or a risk for type 2 diabetes and other chronic illnesses. A better way to look at it would be informed by metabolic health and the carbohydrate-insulin model, which suggests that obesity, an excess of fat accumulation, is itself a manifestation of metabolic illness, and so are these other chronic illnesses. So instead of thinking as obesity as a cause, it's a marker for metabolic derangement. Okay. If we take that definition, we're going to have a profound impact on how we look at animal-sourced food in humanity's diet. Because right now, if I don't look at malnutrition that way, if I only think of it as a lack, okay, 2 to 3 million deaths a year is a shame. But if we take a more expansive look at malnutrition, it increases that number by a factor of 10. Now we're really talking about something that should drive policy and investment and dedication of resources and redirect how we look at animal-sourced food production systems. If we talk about sustainability, we have to be talking about different buckets, right? Societal, economic, environmental. And environmental is more than merely greenhouse gas emissions. We understand that. Let's plug this malnutrition into that framework. 60 to 70% of humanity are malnourished by this expansive definition. 60 to 70%. And you can read the numbers. I've published all my slides on my social media accounts, and I'm happy to share. If we look at the economic burden, we're talking somewhere between 5.8 and 6.5 trillion dollars US every year in healthcare costs. That's direct and indirect expense. This is an enormous impact and a restriction on the potential economic development in some regions of the world. And it has a discernible environmental footprint. Not used to thinking about healthcare as having an environmental footprint, but let's have this conversation about the impact of food systems, right? All the way including the populations we're trying to sustain. So 2 to 4% of global emissions being due to the healthcare necessary to treat malnutrition. For point of reference, beef globally is about 6%. So how do we account for this in the balance as we talk about things? Or how many people are even aware of it? So a quote from the World Health Organization, "Death is inevitable, but a life of protracted ill health is not. Chronic disease prevention and control helps people to live longer and healthier lives." Absolutely. But notice it doesn't say anything in here about remission. What would that look like? We should all strive against the generation and propagation of unnecessary human suffering and pain. To be a human is to suffer. We're going to experience pain. But the fact that so much seems to be unnecessary ought to drive our efforts. And especially those of us in agriculture. This is sort of a fundamental primary industry, and so I want to share a vision with you. And I want to get input from you as to how this vision can grow beyond just me. And maybe refocus some efforts. Our goal in agriculture, our goal as thinking human beings, ought to be about increasing human flourishing. Okay, call me radical. I just think that's a worthy goal. But flourishing requires nourishing. We can't have flourishing human beings if they're malnourished. And cognition requires nutrition. Somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of children globally, 5 and under, are stunted because they haven't received the essential nutrients that are best or solely provided by animal-sourced foods, and their brains don't develop to their potential, and that lasts for their entire life. And that has a discernible drag on economic development. So you can be overfed but undernourished. A key concept. We need people to understand that food is not univocal. That different foods have different values. We're not used to looking at that even when we talk about food systems. And animal source foods, some amount, are essential in the diets of human beings for their proper development and function. This can sound controversial, but it's defensible. How do we spread that message in a way that it can be received by the general public? Now, I'm a grassland guy, I'm a forage guy, I'm a ruminant guy, and I like this idea of humanity's story is from predator to steward, and our story bends back to grass. And we need a ruminant revolution like we needed a green revolution earlier. The green revolution was about providing sufficient calories. Now we need to provide higher quality nutrition for as many people as possible. So in summary, there's a global epidemic of chronic illness, which is the result of a common root, hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance. This is malnutrition, and the products of grassland agriculture will be part of the solution. We need to strive towards increasing productivity and efficiency globally in environmentally wise ways. So what can we do as individuals? Educate yourselves. If I've said anything to encourage you, please contact me. I share information. I make introductions. What can the institutions we're a part of do? What's the role for the American Society of Animal Science or land-grant institutions, or, dare I say it, the Cooperative Extension Service, to spread this information in an effective way through the communities that they serve? So, my contact information, thank you for your attention, thank you for this opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions now or later.
Scott, yes, we have plenty of time for questions.